In this series, we're exploring whether a paradigmatic shift in human consciousness can help us weather the twin crises of the unraveling of the planet's complex life support system and the viability of human civilization. In the first video, we examined the nature of evolution.
In Part 2, we will consider what we mean by an evolution of consciousness. When we speak of an exterior evolution of planets and species and of human society, with its buildings, roads, institutions, technology, etc., we have evidence to which we can point, in the rocks and in the architectural ruins and archaeological artifacts. Simultaneous to this exterior objective material evolution, there is arguably an evolution of the interior, subjective, experiential dimension. This interior dimension within an individual we'll call consciousness. This includes one's feelings, thoughts, memories, and experiences. We'll call the interior dimension of the collective community a culture. The beliefs, values, the norms and expectations, traditions, ritual, etc. We will not need to delve into the philosophical arguments about the primacy of matter and consciousness, whether matter precedes and creates consciousness as the materialists presume, or whether consciousness precedes and creates the material universe as the idealists presume, is irrelevant to our purposes here. What is important is to recognize that culture and human consciousness have changed. If there's no such thing as a car, you never have thoughts about a car or the world with cars. Once it comes into existence, then all the car-related mental thoughts and feelings, and the politics and economics begin as well. Some events are obviously more significant than others. For Americans, the terror attacks of 9/11 was such an event. A far more significant and universal event was the advent of agriculture. All of our ancestors until just a few thousand years ago were hunter-gatherers. Hunting required great cleverness. Animals don't want to be caught. They're fast and strong and clever and dangerous, and humans respected them for these characteristics. And our ancestors had to regard animals as scarce resources as well, perhaps sacred resources. They devised sustainable hunting strategies so that their food source would last indefinitely. Their culture, spirituality, and behaviors reflected these values. With agriculture and the domestication of plants and animals, a different relationship developed with these living creatures. We pinned up animals until we ate them. We made them pull heavy plows and work long hours, rather than letting them run freely upon the earth. Bred over the thousands of years for docility, among other traits, domestic animals do not command the same sort of respect as wild animals. Our relationship with them became more like that of a master and slave. And with some we developed personal relationships. We gave them names, we loved them, and we grieve when they die. Our relationship to our own species changed as well. In hunter-gatherer societies, members of a clan tend to be equals, without permanent headmen. They share food, they work a few hours a day, there is lots of leisure and social time. The anthropologist Marshall Solins called them the original affluent society. With agriculture, the quantity of available food increased, and so population rose. Not everyone was needed to farm the land. Some small percent of the surplus population put their minds and bodies into other endeavors. In every agricultural society, independent and isolated from each other, as were Mesopotamia, the Americas, and the Yangtze River, divisions of labor brought the same sorts of new and novel occupations, products, and human relationships. With these involved differences in power, wealth, and status, and a social hierarchy developed. And just as agriculture had developed independently in several places, within the span of a few thousand years of each other, so did division of labor and social hierarchy. For better and for worse, our relationship to life and to each other changed dramatically. Humans exploited animals and other humans for their ends. As this exploitation became institutionalized, slavery and class divisions were normalized. And so the feelings and thoughts of a civilized person were vastly different from those of hunter-gatherers who had no leaders, no writing, no cities, no massive wars with weapons of mass destruction. This was civilization, the society of agriculture. An environment a world apart from the societies of the hunter-gatherers, an environment that required very different characteristics for one to be successful. Our behaviors, experiences, and awareness changed. That is, our consciousness changed, not necessarily for better or for worse, just to be adaptive to the new environment of civilization. Very quickly, in a matter of a few millennia, civilization became increasingly complex, and therefore our interior experiences became increasingly complex as well. The subjective interior world of consciousness and culture is far more difficult to study than the objective exterior world. One can't easily point to our feelings, thoughts, and memories. We can't measure them or observe them. They require far more interpretation and speculation, and so, until recently, scientists had shied away from studying consciousness. They had neither the neurological tools nor adequate theories connecting brain matter to human experiences. Till recently, consciousness remained the purview of mostly artists and poets, writers, philosophers, mystics, and psychologists. An important question investigated by these early explorers of consciousness, and one relevant to our purposes, revolves around the perfectibility of humans. That is, since our beliefs, values, and behaviors do change with circumstances and events, can one intentionally change her beliefs, values, and behaviors? Or is one locked into a kind of unconscious, involuntary reaction to the environment? And if one can change, is there a preferred evolutionary direction? And are there practices or methods that one can follow to facilitate the desired changes? And what prompts one to want to change? More importantly, what prompts one to actually go to the effort of changing? Given the imperiled future of civilization, and therefore the need to change our beliefs, values, and behaviors, these are questions worth answering. Let's take them one at a time. First, regarding perfectibility. That is, whether a person can intentionally change her beliefs, values, thought patterns, and behaviors. Most people seem to think that we can. Indeed, the Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Taoist, and other Indian and East Asian schools are centered on the very idea of the evolution of consciousness, of its progress and perfectibility, both during this life and in other lifetimes before and after. The West has been more ambivalent on the subject. The Jews, and especially the Christians, come off as a rather pessimistic lot. One does have the free will to make a moral choice, and through God's grace and our discipline we can be better people. However, each generation has the same set of characteristics with which they must struggle. Islam tends to be more optimistic, as were the classical philosophers, including Plato, who accepted the notion of perfectibility, if not complete perfection. In the late 1800s, Friedrich Nietzsche developed the ideal of the Übermensch, translated as Overman or Superman, the pinnacle of human possibility, the self-perfected man, the one who has acquired self-mastery. Soon after Nietzsche, however, most of Western philosophy left speculations about the nature of consciousness to the others, to the psychologists, poets, artists, and mystics, and now to the neuroscientists as well. From the field of psychology emerged an evolutionary paradigm of human consciousness, as well as numerous ways of mapping the underlying structures. Collectively, psychologists have attempted to map the developmental process of a person through her life cognitively, emotionally, morally, and spiritually. Many other fields have contributed to the notion that the consciousness of humans, both the average consciousness of the society and the leading-edge consciousness of some of its individuals, has evolved in our species as a historical process. On grand societal scales, they have mapped the evolution of cultural worldviews, social systems, and cultural ecologies. And not surprisingly, many parallels have risen among their maps. Also not a surprise, the models developed by these 20th century Western thinkers were similar to the developmental models of some of the older Eastern schools, including those of yoga and Buddhism and the yogic concept of the chakras. Here are some basic features of the evolution of humanity's collective consciousness. 1. Culture has evolved along a trajectory analogous to individual consciousness. For example, infants and early foragers see the world as magical and capricious, whereas young children and those living in feudal empires can easily be led to believe in powerful gods or a personal god with whom we can communicate and negotiate the terms of our existence. In adolescence and during a society's enlightenment, reality is perceived in a more sophisticated way. In this universe, there are laws that are consistent and potentially apprehensible through reason and experience. In the East, these impersonal laws are called Dharma, Dhamma, and the Tao. An adult, and in a postmodern society, may understand the universe to be more complex, dynamic, evolutionary, wondrous, even integrated, and so forth. Feature 2. This evolution of worldviews can be cut up into any number of phases or stages, 4, 5, 6, 8. Feature 3. Not everyone, everywhere, is at the same stage. One can visualize a society's consciousness as a bell curve, where most people in a society fall within what the philosopher Clare Graves called a center of psychic gravity. Other people, in either previous more simple worldviews or in more sophisticated worldviews, fill out the tails of the curve, or can be seen as inhabiting other curves. With time, the psychic center of the predominant or normal worldview changes. Viewed in this way, they can be seen as the French historian Francis Braudel described grand waves of history. Those who have inhabited worldviews far advanced for their time have been revered as civilization's heroes. Siddhartha Gautama, Jesus Christ, Mirabai, St. Francis of Assisi, Teresa of Avila, Muhammad Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. all serve as examples. And some societies have served as exemplars of human possibility for the time. Contemporary Ladakh, contemporary Kerala, contemporary Vermont, yes, Vermont, Catalonia, Spain during the Spanish Civil War, the 3rd century BCE Maurya Empire under Ashoka's rule, and the Golden Age of Athens during the 5th century BCE. Ideas about the leading edge of human consciousness have been particularly influenced by Teilhard de Chardin and Sri Aurobindo. Teilhard de Chardin was trained as a paleontologist and Jesuit priest. Sri Aurobindo was an intellectual and Hindu mystic. Both saw the evolution of consciousness as a progressive dynamical process that was the logical flowering of material evolution toward an ultimate wholeness with the universe. Teilhard de Chardin proposed that the increasing complexity and consciousness of humans is directly related to the evolution of the universe. This complexity consciousness is an emergent property of matter itself. Similarly, Sri Aurobindo said, evolution is not finished. Reason is not the last word, nor the reasoning animal the supreme figure of nature. As man emerged out of the animal, so out of man the superman emerges. On the one hand, these two mystics' evolutionary models serve to philosophically reintegrate the dualistic split of materialism and idealism. On the other, the models were logical expressions of a universal spiritual worldview called the Great Chain of Being, where reality becomes ever more aware of itself. Whereas materialistic science is presently at odds over how to even interpret consciousness, the two mystics saw ordinary human consciousness not as some inexplicable evolutionary endpoint, but rather as an early stage in the long continuum of being. A fourth feature of our collective consciousness, the evolutionary process, is replete with paradox and complexity. Gebser, for example, noted that the process of evolutionary change in collective consciousness is not smooth, simple, and continuous. Rather, it evolves in fits and starts and punctuated jumps. Changes in consciousness are invisible until they have developed sufficient strength. And any one dominant worldview overlaps with many other worldviews. The transpersonal philosopher Ken Wilber has suggested that there are multiple realms in which an individual and a society can evolve. A person can be highly developed cognitively and yet be emotionally and ecologically immature. With a rise in cognitive maturity, for instance, technological sophistication has brought us longevity and material comfort, as well as horrific ways to kill, maim, and torture, an increase in inequality and environmental destruction. In a lifetime, few people make it through all the developmental stages and all the various intelligences. Most get stuck along the way, content to worship their powerful God, for example, or to analyze the world through a rational, scientific lens only. However, any one individual in each society may sit anywhere along the vast, many-dimensional spectrum of possibilities. This would be their center of psychic gravity. We do not consistently inhabit this statistical center. A person may act childish one moment and then selfless in the next, as will a society. Anything that emerges through reality's evolutionary process immediately influences its environment and is influenced by it. Therefore, it exists in a continual state of tension with the rest, sometimes in harmony, sometimes struggling, sometimes in crisis. With agriculture, urbanization, and science, we have acted with increasing power in nature's garden, and at the same time have grown ever more separate from nature. On the one hand, the notion of ourselves as transcendent, different from nature, and living in an evolutionary universe has served as a powerful psycho-spiritual catalyst, helping us to view the universe with greater clarity than we had before. By clarifying the notions of a self separate from all the rest, delineated by the surface of our bodies, we also lost our deep connection, physical and metaphysical, to the rest. Similarly, the later individualism of the European-led Enlightenment served to help people question and eventually overcome the dogmas and limitations of religion and nobility. It also served as the ultimate philosophical legitimacy for capitalism and technological innovation. The mechanistic ideology of science meshed comfortably with the emergence of capitalism. Both were viewed as being objective and value-free, neutral instruments that we could employ to manipulate nature in the service of humanity. As it turned out, in becoming increasingly unaware of our connection to the rest of nature, the productive forces of capitalism and the manipulative powers of science and technology overwhelmed the psycho-spiritual capacity of our species. The economic and social theorist Jeremy Rifkin has noted that some other uncomfortable paradoxes come with the evolution of consciousness. For one, countries whose citizens express and exhibit some of the most advanced worldviews tend to also be the most economically developed and historically the most environmentally and socially exploitive countries. The United Kingdom, Spain, Holland, Germany, France, Japan, and the U.S. all come to mind. It is generally in these countries where women's rights and minority rights have evolved the farthest, as have animal rights, proactive environmental laws, abolishment of the death penalty. For further irony, Rifkin also notes that just as we are getting a sense of this more mature perspective, one which could help us live in harmony with the rest of nature, we are facing the dire consequences of our historical immaturity. Destruction of the environment is accelerating on a global scale. The population explosion continues, and the suffering of billions due to hunger, violence, and disease shows little sign of abating. Just as we awaken to our destructive power, the lights may be going off for many of our human family. We have become materially comfortable and spiritually evolved by harnessing the abundant fossilized photosynthetic energy of the past eons, and by the trashing of our planetary home. And so, the human predicament is this: how does civilization continue to serve the billions of humans now living, and the billions more expected this century, and somehow feed the billions who have not been well served so far, and do all this without further destroying our planet and killing off more species?